1361 descended upon Bursa with unusually bitter cold, the snow accumulating on the palace courtyards where Sultan Orhan Ghazi, now 73 years old, sat wrapped in thick woolen robes before a roaring brazier, his once powerful frame reduced to fragile bones barely concealed beneath sagging skin. The man who had transformed a minor frontier principality into a formidable empire spanning 2 continents now struggled with tasks as simple as walking from his chamber to the throne room without assistance. His attendants watched with concern as the Sultan's hands trembled while holding documents, as his breath came in labored gasps after minimal exertion, as his legendary mental acuity flickered between moments of crystalline clarity and disturbing confusion. The physicians who attended him daily whispered among themselves that the great leader's time was drawing to a close, though none dared speak such thoughts aloud in his presence. The progression of Orhan's decline had been gradual, yet relentless, beginning approximately 2 years earlier when he first experienced episodes of severe chest pain that left him gasping and pale. The court physicians, trained in the medical traditions inherited from Greek, Arab, and Persian sources, diagnosed an imbalance of humors and prescribed various treatments: bloodletting to reduce excess blood, herbal concoctions to strengthen the heart, dietary restrictions eliminating foods considered heating to the temperament. None of these interventions provided more than temporary relief. The Sultan, who had survived countless battles, political intrigues, and assassination attempts during his 35-year reign, found himself defeated by an enemy no sword could strike: the inexorable deterioration of his aging body. Modern medical historians examining the symptoms described in contemporary chronicles suggest Orhan likely suffered from congestive heart failure complicated by what was probably chronic respiratory disease, conditions for which 14th century medicine offered no effective treatment. Orhan's mental state during these final months alternated between profound lucidity and moments of disorientation that terrified those around him. On good days, he would summon his advisors and discuss matters of state with the same strategic brilliance that had characterized his entire reign, offering insights into diplomatic negotiations with Byzantine factions or military deployments in Anatolia that demonstrated his intellect remained fundamentally intact. Yet increasingly, there were bad days when he seemed lost in time, calling for his long-dead father Osman, speaking to his deceased eldest son Suleiman as though he were still alive, or becoming agitated about threats from enemies who had been dead for decades. His son Murad and the palace officials carefully managed these episodes, ensuring that foreign ambassadors and provincial governors only received audiences during the Sultan's lucid periods to maintain the appearance of continued strong leadership. The physical symptoms that plagued Orhan's final year included severe swelling of his legs and feet, extreme fatigue that left him bedridden for days at a time, persistent coughing that produced bloody phlegm, and episodes of labored breathing so severe that he had to be propped upright on cushions to prevent suffocation. The palace physician supplied poultices, administered tinctures of digitalis derived from foxglove plants, accidentally stumbling upon one of the few medieval remedies that actually has cardiovascular benefits, and performed regular bloodletting that likely weakened him further rather than providing relief. Orhan endured these treatments with stoic patience, occasionally remarking with dark humor that he had faced less torture from his enemies than from his own doctors. His religious faith intensified during this period, as he spent hours in prayer and Quranic recitation, seeking spiritual preparation for the death he knew approached. The political implications of Orhan's visible decline created anxiety throughout the Ottoman state. Medieval Islamic political theory held that the ruler's health directly reflected divine favor, and a visibly failing sultan could encourage rebellions, embolden enemies, or trigger succession disputes. Murad, the designated heir, walked a delicate balance between preparing to assume full authority and avoiding any appearance of eagerness for his father's death that might alienate supporters or provide ammunition to potential rivals. He increased his visibility in ceremonial functions, personally led military expeditions to demonstrate continuity of leadership, and carefully cultivated relationships with powerful military commanders and provincial governors. Yet he also made regular displays of filial devotion, spending hours at his father's bedside, publicly consulting him on major decisions, and ensuring everyone understood he ruled as regent on behalf of his still living father, rather than as independent authority. The emotional toll of impending death weighed heavily on Orhan during his lucid moments. He had outlived most of his contemporaries, watched his beloved eldest son Suleiman die in a senseless accident, and witnessed enough of human nature's darker aspects during decades of warfare and politics to harbor few illusions about mortality or legacy. Yet he also took satisfaction in the empire he had built from almost nothing, the institutions he had created that would outlast him, and the knowledge that his life's work would continue through his capable son. In private conversations with close companions, chroniclers later reported, Orhan spoke philosophically about death as the inevitable conclusion to every life, expressing hope that God would judge him mercifully despite the blood on his hands from decades of conquest. Even the most pious ruler must acknowledge the moral complexities inherent in building empires. 1362 arrived with Sultan Orhan confined almost entirely to his palace quarters, the vibrant capital of Bursa continuing its bustling commercial and administrative activities, while its founder lay dying in chambers overlooking the city he had transformed. The early months of that year brought a temporary improvement in his condition, a phenomenon physicians called a rally that sometimes precedes final decline, during which the Sultan's strength partially returned and his mental clarity sharpened. He used this reprieve to address urgent matters he had been too ill to handle during the worst of winter, receiving foreign embassies, resolving disputes among his governors, and most importantly, having lengthy private conversations with Murad about governance philosophy and strategic priorities. These discussions, preserved in somewhat romanticized form by later Ottoman chroniclers, covered everything from military tactics to religious policy to the treatment of Christian subjects. According to historical accounts documented by scholars such as Halilif Nalakand, whose authoritative works on early Ottoman history provide detailed analysis of this period, Orhan used these final lucid weeks to formalize arrangements for succession and ensure institutional continuity. He issued formal decrees confirming Murad's authority over European territories and designating him as official heir to the entire empire, eliminating any legal ambiguity that might encourage rival claimants. He distributed generous grants to potential troublemakers among his nephews and cousins, essentially buying their acquiescence to Murad's succession through Timar estates and provincial governorships that provided wealth and status without actual power. He confirmed appointments of key administrators, military commanders, and religious officials, creating a governing structure loyal to both himself and his son that would survive the transition. These careful preparations reflected lessons learned from observing countless succession crises in neighboring states, where unclear succession arrangements had triggered devastating civil wars. The Sultan's relationship with his family during these final months revealed both the warmth and complexity of Ottoman domestic life. His wife, Nilüfer Hatun, who had been his companion for over 4 decades, rarely left his side during his illness, personally supervising his care and managing the palace household with quiet efficiency. Their younger children visited regularly, though Orhan sometimes struggled to recognize them during his confused episodes. The presence of his Greek wife Theodora, daughter of Byzantine Emperor John VI Kantakazanos, highlighted the unusual nature of Ottoman religious tolerance. She had maintained her Christian faith throughout their marriage, and now prayed in her private chapel for her husband's soul according to Orthodox Christian rites, while Muslim clerics recited Quranic verses in adjacent chambers. This peaceful coexistence of different faiths within the royal household embodied the pragmatic religious pluralism that had become an Ottoman hallmark. Orhan's deteriorating health during late winter and early spring manifested in increasingly severe symptoms that terrified his attendants and confirmed the physician's pessimistic prognoses. He experienced episodes of what modern medicine would recognize as pulmonary edema, where fluid accumulation in his lungs made breathing so difficult that he gasped desperately for air while his face turned bluish. The palace doctors tried increasingly desperate remedies, special prayers, and amulets containing Quranic verses, dietary restrictions so severe he barely ate, herbal preparations so noxious they induced vomiting, and bloodletting sessions that left him even weaker. Some physicians suggested amputation of the severely swollen legs to prevent the corruption from spreading to vital organs, but senior medical advisors wisely counseled against such drastic intervention that would almost certainly kill a patient already so weakened. The Sultan's spiritual preparation for death intensified as his physical condition worsened. He requested that religious scholars read the entire Quran in his presence, distributed substantial charitable donations to the poor and to religious institutions, freed several of his slaves as acts of pious merit, and dictated detailed instructions for his funeral and burial. He expressed particular concern about the condition of his soul, repeatedly asking the Islamic jurists who attended him whether his actions as ruler had violated divine law. They reassured him that jihad conducted against infidels, governance according to Islamic principles, and protection of the faith all earned divine favor. Though privately some scholars must have pondered the theological status of a ruler whose reign inevitably involved deception, violence, and moral compromises, medieval Islamic political theology wrestled constantly with the tension between the ethical demands of religion and the practical requirements of governance. The palace atmosphere during these months combined normal administrative bustle with the subdued tension of a household awaiting death. Officials conducted state business as usual, embassies were received with proper ceremony, military campaigns continued in border regions, and the machinery of Ottoman governance functioned smoothly despite the founder's incapacitation. Yet everyone from the highest beezer to the lowest servant understood they were living through a historic transition. Whispered conversations in corridors speculated about when the end would come, whether succession would proceed peacefully, how Murad's reign might differ from his father's, and what the Sultan's death might mean for each person's career and fortune. Such calculations, however mercenary they might appear, were simple prudence in an environment where regime changes often triggered purges and reorganizations that could elevate or destroy individuals overnight. March 1362 brought unseasonably warm weather to Bursa, the early spring sun melting the last remnants of winter snow and coaxing blossoms from the fruit trees in the palace gardens. Nature's renewal, providing cruel contrast to the dying sultan lying in his chamber. Orhan's condition had deteriorated markedly over the preceding weeks, his periods of lucidity becoming briefer and less frequent, his physical strength failing to the point where he could no longer rise from his bed without multiple attendants supporting his weight. The palace physicians, recognizing that death was now imminent rather than merely probable, informed Murad that his father likely had only days remaining. The crown prince immediately dispatched urgent messages to key provincial governors, military commanders, and religious leaders, ensuring they would be positioned to declare loyalty to the new sultan immediately upon Orhan's death, preventing any window of uncertainty that rivals might exploit. The sultan's final days were spent in a large chamber specially prepared for his comfort, its windows overlooking the city he had conquered 36 years earlier and transformed into the Ottoman capital. When coherent, he would sometimes ask attendants to describe the view. The markets bustling with merchants from a dozen nations, the minarets of mosques he had commissioned rising above the skyline, the caravanserais filled with traders' goods, the bathhouses and madrasas and charitable kitchens that served the city's diverse population. These descriptions seemed to give him satisfaction, confirming that his life's work had produced tangible, enduring results. During his confused periods, he often spoke in the Turkish dialect of his youth, rather than the more refined court language he had adopted as sultan, calling out names of warriors who had died decades earlier, recounting battles from his early reign, sometimes laughing at remembered jokes, or weeping at remembered sorrows. The religious observances surrounding the dying sultan intensified as death approached. Islamic tradition encourages believers to facilitate a good death for the faithful through specific spiritual practices, and Orhan's attendants followed these customs meticulously. Respected religious scholars maintained an almost constant presence in his chamber, quietly reciting Quranic verses believed to ease the soul's departure from the body. They particularly emphasized the chapter Yasin, traditionally recited for the dying, its rhythmic Arabic verses filling the room with sacred sound. Orhan, even in his weakened state, occasionally moved his lips in sync with familiar passages, demonstrating that decades of religious observance had embedded these words deep in his memory. His family members took turns sitting with him, holding his hand, speaking words of comfort and reassurance, fulfilling the Islamic emphasis on communal support during life's final transition. Murad's emotional state during his father's final days combined genuine grief with the practical necessity of preparing for succession. Historical sources suggest he maintained vigil at Orhan's bedside for hours each day, sometimes reading to his father from favorite texts, other times simply sitting in companionable silence. Yet he also spent considerable time in urgent consultations with military commanders and administrators, finalizing arrangements for the transfer of power. Medieval succession was always perilous. Even when a designated heir enjoyed broad support, the period immediately following a ruler's death created opportunities for ambitious rivals or foreign enemies to exploit perceived weakness. Murad understood that the hours immediately after his father's death would be critical, requiring swift, decisive action to assert authority and prevent challenges. Filial devotion and political necessity intertwined inseparably during those tense March days. The physicians attending Orhan could offer increasingly little beyond comfort measures as his condition progressed beyond any possibility of recovery. They administered opium-based tinctures to ease his breathing difficulties and pain, provided sponge baths to reduce fever and maintain cleanliness, adjusted his position regularly to prevent bed sores, and ensured he received small amounts of water and broth to prevent dehydration. Modern medical understanding suggests Orhan was likely experiencing multi-organ system failure, as his failing heart could no longer adequately pump blood throughout his body. leading to fluid accumulation in lungs, kidney dysfunction, liver compromise, and eventually cardiac arrest. The medieval physicians lacked this pathophysiological understanding, but could recognize the clinical signs that death approached: the characteristic death rattle as fluid accumulated in airways, the mottling of extremities as circulation failed, the decreasing responsiveness to external stimuli. The atmosphere in the palace during those final days was described by contemporary observers as combining profound sadness with anxious anticipation. Servants who had known Orhan for decades wept openly, remembering his personal kindnesses and the transformation he had wrought in their lives and their society. Military commanders gathered in palace courtyards, ostensibly waiting for news, but also positioning themselves to immediately pledge loyalty to Murad upon the Sultan's death. Foreign ambassadors maintained discreet presence, preparing to send urgent dispatches to their governments announcing the leadership change. Religious scholars debated fine points of funeral protocol and succession theology. Merchants in the city's bazaars worried about potential instability affecting trade. Through all this human drama, the old Sultan lay dying, the center of attention yet increasingly disconnected from the world his actions had shaped so profoundly. The night of March 6, 1362, proved to be Sultan Orhan's last. Though those keeping vigil at his bedside could not know with certainty that the end had finally arrived until morning light revealed what darkness had obscured. The Sultan had lapsed into complete unconsciousness during the previous afternoon, his breathing becoming increasingly irregular and labored, interspersed with long pauses that made watchers hold their own breath, wondering if each cessation marked his death. The religious scholars intensified their Quranic recitations, the beautiful Arabic verses filling the chamber with sacred sound intended to ease the soul's journey from body to afterlife. Family members crowded into the room despite the late hour, none willing to be absent when the patriarch's life ended, each dealing with impending loss in individual ways, some weeping quietly, others sitting in stunned silence, a few praying fervently. Murad maintained position closest to his father's bed throughout that long night, holding the old man's hand, feeling the pulse grow progressively weaker and more erratic. Historical accounts suggest the crown prince spoke quietly to his unconscious father during those final hours, thanking him for wisdom imparted, promising to honor his legacy, asking forgiveness for any failings as a son, and pledging to continue the work of building the Ottoman state. Whether Orhan could hear these words at some level of consciousness or had already progressed beyond awareness remains unknowable, but the act of speaking them clearly provided Murad emotional solace during an intensely painful vigil. The human need to communicate with dying loved ones transcends particular cultures or centuries, reflecting the universal difficulty of accepting that someone vitally important will soon be irretrievably gone. The moment of death, when it finally came in the early, pre-dawn hours of March 7th, was described by those present as surprisingly peaceful after the struggles of preceding days. Orhan's labored breathing, which had dominated the chamber's soundscape for hours, gradually became shallower and slower until one breath simply was not followed by another. The physicians, experienced in recognizing death, checked for pulse and respiration, then solemnly confirmed what everyone already knew: Sultan Orhan Gazi, second ruler of the Ottoman dynasty, architect of Ottoman institutions, conqueror of Bursa and founder of the European bridgehead, had completed his earthly journey at approximately 73 years of age after a reign of 36 years. The religious scholars immediately recited the traditional Islamic declaration: "Indeed we belong to Allah, and indeed to Him we will return," reminding all present that death is the inevitable destination of every soul regardless of worldly power or achievement. The immediate aftermath of Orhan's death revealed the efficiency of Murad's succession planning. Even before the sun rose over Bursa, trusted messengers were galloping toward key military garrisons and provincial capitals, carrying sealed letters announcing the Sultan's death and commanding loyalty to Sultan Murad I. Palace officials moved swiftly to secure the treasury, arsenal, and other strategic locations against any possibility of coup attempts. Religious leaders were summoned to the palace to witness Murad's formal accession and provide Islamic legitimacy to the succession. Senior military commanders assembled in the throne room to publicly pledge allegiance to the new sultan, their oaths recorded by scribes to create legal documentation of the transfer of authority. By the time most of Bursa's population awoke to news of Orhan's death, Murad was already functioning as undisputed ruler with the machinery of state firmly under his control. The preparations for Orhan's funeral began immediately, following Islamic tradition that the deceased should be buried quickly, preferably before sunset on the day of death, or at most within 24 hours. The Sultan's body was ritually washed by religious officials according to prescribed procedures, wrapped in simple white shrouds as Islamic tradition mandates. Even sultans are buried in plain cloth rather than elaborate garments, emphasizing equality before God and death. The body was then placed on a simple bier, again following the Islamic principle that funeral ostentation is inappropriate regardless of the deceased's worldly rank. These preparations took place in private chambers with only essential religious officials present, maintaining the dignity and sanctity appropriate for the final care of a Muslim ruler's earthly remains. The public announcement of Orhan's death produced diverse reactions throughout the Ottoman domains and beyond. In Bursa and other Ottoman cities, populations that had known no other ruler for decades mourned genuinely. Shops closed as merchants suspended business, and citizens gathered in mosques for special prayers for the deceased sultan's soul. Military units that had served under Orhan's command held memorial ceremonies honoring their fallen commander. Provincial governors who owed their positions to Orhan's patronage expressed grief while simultaneously calculating how to maintain their status under the new sultan. In Byzantine territories, reactions mixed relief that a formidable enemy had died with anxiety about whether his successor might prove even more dangerous. Italian merchant republic sent diplomatic condolences while immediately opening negotiations with Murad to ensure commercial privileges would continue. The diplomatic dance surrounding royal deaths, where sincere emotion and cold calculation intertwined inseparably, played out across the eastern Mediterranean. March 7, 1362. Witness Bursa transformed into a city of mourning, as tens of thousands of Ottoman subjects gathered to pay final respects to the sultan who had ruled them for over 3 decades. The funeral procession, though conducted according to Islamic principles emphasizing simplicity and equality before God, nonetheless became a massive public event reflecting Orhan's importance and the empire's need to demonstrate continuity and strength during this vulnerable transition moment. The body, wrapped in plain white shrouds and placed on an uncovered bier according to Islamic custom, was carried through Bursa's streets by military commanders who had served under Orhan for decades, their faces reflecting genuine grief for a leader they had followed through countless campaigns. Religious scholars walked alongside, chanting Quranic verses, their melodious Arabic recitations creating an atmosphere of sacred solemnity. Sultan Murad I led the mourners, walking immediately behind his father's bier in a public display of filial devotion and legitimate succession. He wore simple garments rather than elaborate royal robes, following Islamic tradition that ostentation is inappropriate during funeral rites regardless of rank. Behind Murad walked other members of the royal family, senior government officials, provincial governors who would hasten to Bursa upon receiving news of Orhan's final illness, military commanders from across Ottoman territories, and representatives of foreign powers whose governments maintained diplomatic relations with the Ottoman state. The presence of Christian and Jewish community leaders in the procession, walking respectfully among the Muslim mourners, testified to the religious tolerance that had characterized Orhan's reign and would continue as Ottoman policy. The crowd lining the streets represented the extraordinary diversity of Ottoman society: Turkish warriors, Greek merchants, Armenian craftsmen, Jewish traders, Slavic peasants, all united in mourning a ruler who had governed them with relative justice and provided unprecedented stability. The funeral prayers took place in the courtyard of the Grand Mosque Orhan had commissioned decades earlier, a building that embodied his vision of Ottoman architectural synthesis combining Seljuk Turkish, Byzantine Greek, and Arab Islamic elements. Thousands of mourners crowded into the mosque and surrounding areas as the imam led the janazah, the specific funeral prayer prescribed in Islamic tradition. This prayer, performed standing in ranks and lacking the prostrations of regular prayers, asks God's mercy for the deceased and forgiveness for sins. The imam's voice, amplified by the mosque's acoustic design, carried across the assembled multitude as he recited the traditional supplications: "O Allah, forgive him and have mercy on him, pardon him and grant him security, and make his resting place spacious." The collective Amin, from thousands of voices, created a sound that witnesses later described as both mournful and somehow comforting, a community united in asking divine mercy for their departed leader. The burial itself took place in a mausoleum Orhan had commissioned for himself years earlier, recognizing that even sultans must eventually face mortality and prepare for death. The tomb, located in a prominent position overlooking Bursa, was built in a style that would become characteristic of Ottoman royal burials. A domed octagonal structure with elaborate calligraphic decoration featuring Quranic verses about death, judgment, and divine mercy. Islamic tradition requires burial directly in earth contact, so Orhan's shrouded body was lowered into a grave beneath the mausoleum floor, positioned on its right side facing toward Mecca as religious law mandates. The grave was then filled with earth, and a simple stone marker inscribed with his name, titles, and death date was placed to identify the burial location. Despite the architectural magnificence of the surrounding mausoleum, the actual interment followed the Islamic principle that all humans return to dust regardless of worldly status. The mourning period that followed Orhan's burial reflected both Islamic religious custom and Ottoman political necessity. Traditional Islamic practice encourages 3 days of heightened mourning for deceased family members, during which normal activities are suspended and visitors come to offer condolences. The royal family observed this period privately while Murad simultaneously conducted the urgent business of consolidating his succession. He received pledges of loyalty from provincial governors, confirmed or replaced key administrators based on their reliability, dispatched military forces to frontier regions to prevent enemies from exploiting the transition period, and issued his first royal decrees establishing the continuity of existing policies while asserting his personal authority. This combination of personal grief and political calculation characterized the complex reality of royal succession in medieval Islamic states, where family tragedy and state crisis intertwined inseparably. The public commemorations of Orhan's life and reign extended well beyond the immediate funeral period, as the new sultan understood that honoring his father served both filial piety and political legitimacy. Murad commissioned scholars to compile histories of Orhan's reign, emphasizing his administrative innovations, military victories, and pious foundation of religious institutions. He ensured that regular Quranic recitations and prayers for Orhan's soul took place at the tomb, employing religious scholars specifically for this purpose and endowing the mausoleum with property whose revenues funded these perpetual commemorations. He ordered the construction of additional mosques, schools, and charitable institutions in Orhan's name, creating lasting monuments that would keep the founder's memory alive for future generations. These acts combined genuine respect for his father's achievements with calculated efforts to associate the new reign with the prestige and legitimacy of the old. The question of what precisely killed Sultan Orhan, while answered simplistically as old age by contemporary sources, becomes more complex when examined through modern medical understanding applied to the symptoms described in historical chronicles. The detailed accounts preserved by court chroniclers and later Ottoman historians provide enough clinical information to permit retrospective diagnosis, though such exercises remain necessarily speculative given the impossibility of definitive confirmation. The constellation of symptoms Orhan experienced during his final years: progressive swelling of legs and feet, severe shortness of breath, especially when lying flat, episodes of productive cough with bloody sputum, extreme fatigue, and eventual multi-organ decline point strongly toward congestive heart failure as the primary pathology. This condition, where the heart's pumping efficiency progressively deteriorates, causes fluid to back up into lungs and accumulate in dependent body parts, explaining virtually all the manifestations his physicians documented. The underlying cause of Orhan's heart failure likely involved multiple contributing factors typical for men of his age and life circumstances in the 14th century. Decades of physical exertion during military campaigns, numerous battle injuries that chroniclers mentioned but rarely detailed, probable hypertension exacerbated by the chronic stress of ruling an expanding empire, and possibly rheumatic heart disease stemming from untreated streptococcal infections during youth, all could have progressively damaged his cardiovascular system. Additionally, the medieval diet of the elite, heavy in meat and salt with limited fresh vegetables during many months, would have contributed to arterial disease. The medical treatments he received, particularly the frequent bloodletting that physicians believed balanced humors but actually weakened patients by inducing anemia, probably accelerated his decline rather than providing benefit. The foxglove-derived preparations some physicians administered represented accidental discovery of digitalis, one of the few medieval cardiac treatments that actually possesses therapeutic value, though dosing was crude and inconsistent. The historical significance of Orhan's death extended far beyond the personal tragedy of a ruler's demise, fundamentally shaping the trajectory of Ottoman development and regional geopolitics for decades afterward. His successful transmission of power to Murad established a crucial precedent for Ottoman succession, demonstrating that the transition between sultans could occur smoothly without triggering the succession wars that had destroyed many other medieval dynasties. This precedent, though it would be violated in later Ottoman history when succession struggles became routine, provided essential stability during the empire's formative period. Murad inherited not just territories but functioning institutions, trained administrators, established military systems, and diplomatic relationships that his father had spent decades developing. He could build on these foundations rather than starting from scratch or spending years fighting rivals for the throne. The timing of Orhan's death, occurring when Ottoman power had been firmly established in both Anatolia and Europe, but before the empire had grown so large as to be unwieldy. Proved remarkably fortunate for Ottoman expansion. Had he died a decade earlier, the European foothold would have been too recent and fragile to survive potential Byzantine counterattacks or European crusading efforts. Had he lived significantly longer, his advanced age and declining faculties might have resulted in policy paralysis or poor decisions that undermined previous achievements. His death at 73, after 36 years of reign, represented almost ideal timing for dynastic transition, long enough to firmly establish the state's foundations, short enough that his successor could assume power while still in his prime years. Such fortunate timing appears almost providential to later Ottoman historians who saw divine favor in the dynasty's rise. The manner of Orhan's death, peaceful, surrounded by family, after adequate time to prepare spiritually and politically for the transition, contrasted sharply with the violent ends that befell so many medieval rulers. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts emphasize this peaceful passing as evidence of divine approval for Orhan's reign and governance. Islamic theological tradition holds that a good death, defined as one where the believer remains conscious long enough to recite the Shahada, declaration of faith, and dies in a state of spiritual preparation, indicates God's mercy toward that soul. Orhan's death, with religious scholars present to facilitate proper spiritual preparation and family members available to fulfill final wishes, met all criteria for a good death according to Islamic understanding. This religiously significant manner of dying enhanced his reputation and by extension legitimized the Ottoman dynasty's claim to divine favor and right to rule. Modern historical scholarship examining Orhan's death and its aftermath has emphasized how the smooth succession to Murad represented a critical turning point in Ottoman institutional development. Historians such as Colin Imber and Simal Kafadar, whose detailed analyses of early Ottoman history provide authoritative frameworks for understanding this period, have argued that the precedent established by Orhan's peaceful death and Mur's unchallenged succession created expectations for orderly power transfer that, despite later violations, remained an ideal toward which the dynasty aspired. The contrast with neighboring Turkish beyliks that frequently dissolved into succession struggles after their founders' deaths, or with the Byzantine Empire, where imperial succession remained chronically contested and violent, demonstrated the comparative strength of emerging Ottoman institutional structures. The tomb of Sultan Orhan Gazi in Bursa became, within years of his burial, not merely a grave but a pilgrimage site, where Ottoman sultans, officials, and common citizens came to pray and seek spiritual blessing from the founder's spirit. The practice of visiting saints' tombs, though somewhat controversial in strict Islamic theology which forbids intercession between humans and God, had become deeply embedded in popular Turkish Islamic practice through Sufi influence. Orhan, though not formally recognized as a saint, was venerated as a Ghazi warrior who had fought for Islam, and a just ruler who had governed according to divine law, making his tomb an appropriate place for prayers and spiritual reflection. Successive sultans maintained and embellished the mausoleum, adding elaborate tile work, endowing it with property to fund perpetual Quranic recitations, and ensuring it remained among Bursa's most impressive monuments. The tomb served both religious and political functions, connecting later sultans to the dynasty's founder and legitimizing their rule through association with his achievements. The historical assessment of Orhan's reign and the impact of his death on subsequent Ottoman development reveals a leader whose importance equals or exceeds that of his more famous father Osman, despite the latter giving his name to the dynasty. While Osman created a small frontier principality through military prowess and charismatic leadership, Orhan transformed that tribal confederation into a functioning state with administrative institutions, legal structures, military organization, and diplomatic sophistication that could support unlimited expansion. The systems he established, the Timur military, feudal organization, the dual legal framework combining Sharia and customary law, the religiously tolerant approach to governing diverse populations, the synthesis of nomadic Turkish traditions with settled Islamic administrative practices all persisted for centuries as fundamental features of Ottoman governance. In this sense, Orhan's death marked not an ending but the transition from founder to legacy, from personal leadership to institutional permanence. The comparison between Orhan's death and those of other contemporary rulers illuminates both the man's character and the Ottoman state's unusual stability. During the same 14th century, European monarchs frequently died violently in battles, assassinations, or dynastic conflicts, while Mongol khans and Turkish emirs were regularly murdered by rivals or sons impatient for power. The Byzantine Empire, Ottoman's principal adversary, had witnessed Emperor Andronakos III die young, possibly from poisoning, Emperor John V imprisoned multiple times by rivals, and Emperor John VI Kantakouzenos forced into monastic retirement. Against this backdrop of endemic political violence and unstable succession, Orhan's peaceful death of natural causes at advanced age and smooth transfer of power to his chosen heir appears almost miraculous. This stability reflected the institutional foundations he had built and the loyalty he had cultivated through decades of just, effective governance. The legend and mythology that accumulated around Orhan's death and subsequent Ottoman historical tradition reveal how later generations interpreted his life and its significance. Court chroniclers writing during the empire's classical period in the 15th and 16th centuries embellished accounts of his final days with elements emphasizing divine favor, dreams foretelling his peaceful death, miraculous occurrences at the moment of his passing, prophetic final words predicting Ottoman future greatness. While modern historians treat such embellishments skeptically, they nonetheless reveal important truths about how Ottomans understood their own origins. By portraying Orhan's death as divinely blessed and historically significant, these chronicles reinforce beliefs in Ottoman providential destiny and dynastic legitimacy that help sustain the empire through subsequent challenges. The literal historical truth of these accounts matters less than their function in creating shared narratives that unify diverse Ottoman subjects under a common identity. The physical decay and eventual destruction of Orhan's original tomb structure over subsequent centuries, followed by its reconstruction and restoration at various points in Ottoman and Turkish history, provides a metaphor for the complex relationship between historical legacy and material remains. The mausoleum suffered earthquake damage multiple times, was rebuilt by various sultans, fell into disrepair during periods of Ottoman decline, and was eventually restored by the Turkish Republic as a historical monument. Each reconstruction reflected the values and concerns of its era. Ottoman restorations emphasized Islamic piety and dynastic continuity, while Republican restoration emphasized national historical heritage and architectural preservation. The tomb visitors encounter today in Bursa is thus a palimpsest of interventions, bearing marks of 6 centuries of changing political systems and cultural values, yet still fundamentally serving its original purpose as a memorial to the empire's greatest state builder. The final assessment of how Sultan Orhan died must therefore encompass multiple dimensions beyond the simple medical fact of heart failure at age 73. He died having transformed a minor Turkish frontier principality into a major regional power spanning 2 continents. He died having established institutions and precedents that would govern an empire for 6 centuries. He died having proven that Turkish Muslims could create sophisticated administrative states rather than merely excelling at nomadic warfare. He died having demonstrated that religious tolerance and pragmatic governance could be more effective than persecution and ideological rigidity. He died having prepared his successor adequately, ensuring that decades of state building would continue rather than collapse into succession chaos. He died peacefully, spiritually prepared, surrounded by family and supporters, achieving the good death that Islamic tradition values as evidence of divine mercy. And he died at precisely the right moment historically, when foundations had been laid, but the great expansion under his successors still awaited. In all these senses, Orhan's death was as carefully executed and historically consequential as his life had been. The Ottoman Empire that mourned Sultan Orhan's passing in March 1362 would continue expanding for another century and a half, conquering Constantinople, subduing the Balkans, defeating European crusaders, and establishing itself as one of history's great powers. Yet all these achievements rested on foundations a dying old man laid during 36 years of patient institution building, strategic brilliance, and administrative innovation. His death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, the transition from personal leadership to institutional empire, from founder's vision to successor's execution. The manner of his death, peaceful, prepared, timely, reflected the character of his life and rule, demonstrating that great leadership consists not merely in dramatic conquests, but in careful preparation for one's inevitable absence, ensuring that the work continues after the worker departs. Sultan Orhan Gazi died as he had lived, strategically, thoughtfully, and with profound consequences for the empire he had built, and the history that would follow his passing.